Hi everyone, welcome to our first panel for the National Survivor Youth Network's Members Event this year, which is about the radical roots and radical futures of peer support. So we're going to be discussing peer support's relationships with activism and change making and exploring what happens when people are given the tools and the resources to take care of each other. We'll be hearing from our panelists and we'll have an opportunity at the end for questions from the audience. So my name is Rory. I'm the Communities and Grants Manager at NSUN. I use he and they pronouns. I'm tuning in from Tottenham today. My work at NSUN involves supporting our member organisations to carry out their work and build alternative models of care and connection. Outside of NSUN, I've also run peer support groups and been involved in organising around a variety of issues, from reproductive rights to resisting police brutality. I'll be one of the chairs today, along with my colleague Elena. I'll pass over to you, Elena.
Hi everyone, my name's Elena. I'm the Communities and Grants Coordinator at NSUN, and my pronouns are she and her. Similarly to Rory, my work revolves around working with member and hosted project organisations to support the delivery of their work. Outside of NSUN, I have been a part of grassroots groups, applying for funding for community projects. And also for my history degree, I explored the importance of peer support in anti-carceral organising against the American prison system. So I'm, really looking forward to today's panel discussion. I'll now pass on to our panelists to introduce themselves. Lisa, we'll start with you if that's okay. And then if you could volunteer the next person to introduce themselves, that would be great.
Thank you. So I'm Lisa Archibald. I'm in Scotland. I've been in peer support for a long time, since the late 90s. So mostly in grassroots communities and in Scotland as well as overseas in New Zealand and Australia. And in the past 10 years, I've been a trainer and a co-director now of intentional peer support. So I've just completed the MAD Studies postgraduate certificate as well. So I'll mention that because I probably have some opinions on that side of things too. Marc, do you want to go next?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Marc Thompson. I'm here in London today, very chilly London. I'm currently the co-director of the Love Tank, which is a not-for-profit community interest company that works to address health inequalities in the most marginalised communities. I've been involved in different forms of peer support, formal and informal, since my own diagnosis of HIV 37 years ago. So I've been involved in developing and implementing, but also receiving peer support myself. And it's really lovely to be here today. And I nominate Anandi.
Hi, I'm Anandi Ramamurthy. I'm in Manchester at the moment. I live here. I helped to found an organisation in Manchester called CHARM, Communities for Holistic, Accessible and Rights-Based Mental Health, so that we could raise questions and campaign for better systems, and also to give ourselves support, and that's both people that are holders, carers for people in distress, as well as experiences of altered states.
So much, everyone. All right, so I guess we can get stuck into the first question for the panel discussion, which is, what does peer support mean to you, and has this changed over time? I guess I'll pick on someone so we don't have the awkward waiting for someone to unmute. Marc, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, peer support is really important to me. And it means, first of all, on a really individual level, the opportunity to connect with people who have a similar experience to me. And that may be to do with my sexuality, my identity, or my ethnicity. But more importantly, my experience has been around my health condition. And it's been really important because it's made me feel connected on a really personal level, less isolated, but then has also provided me with tools, information and education to manage my condition. which has then led me to having better health outcomes directly, has made me feel less isolated, and has also motivated me in many ways to then play that forward. I think it's changed for me over the years as I have got older, and obviously my personal needs have changed, and I've become much more comfortable with who I am. I kind of don't experience HIV stigma in the way that many people do. I have an understanding of treatment and the condition, very often learned from peers of mine. So I don't lean into formal peer support as much as I did 25 years ago, but I still benefit from being part of the community of my peers, because that allows me to feel less alone. I'm able to get new information as when I want to. But I think really importantly, peer support has enabled me to have a voice, and to be vocal about not only HIV, but also other issues which sit alongside that. So it's morphed and it's changed, but it's also been really, really central to my being as a person.
Thank you so much, Marc. Anandi, do you want to pick up from there?
So it's interesting, because I suppose that one of the things I didn't mention in my introduction is I've been an anti-racist activist since the 1980s, and I suppose activism is a sort of type of peer support, because you find people that believe in the same things as you, and then you're campaigning to change those things. But it wasn't a term that I really used or was particularly kind of familiar with until I got more involved in sort of the areas of kind of mental health. And so when I first heard about it, I thought of it as something that was about people that had experienced altered states supporting each other. But now I kind of understand it in a broader way, and I've had lots of support, and I'm part of different support groups for for family members and others. And so I think of it as just supporting each other, learning from each other, sharing information in order to navigate systems, giving each other emotional support, all of those things really. Yeah.
Thanks, Anandi. Lisa?
I suppose just add into what Anandi was saying, like my experience of peer support has probably changed as things have changed. Like when I first was involved with peer support, it was very much about facilitating a space in which peer support happened. People came together and support happened naturally through mutual relationships and through this kind of shared understanding of, like, maybe we're not crazy, but the world is. So I think thinking about more the socio-political aspect is, it wasn't about individual illness or individual problems. It was about, people were recovering from not being loved, having damage in relationships, racism, homophobia, classism, all of that. That was what I saw and what I experienced in those spaces, was this coming together of, why is this not fair? Why is the world unjust? And what can we find in this space to come together? And that, I think, for me, was where it kind of linked to the activism and thinking about, how does collective advocacy fit within that? And what I'm seeing as time goes on is something that's uncomfortable for me, is it's becoming more about individualistic peer support, which is like, come and have a spoonful of peer support and this will make you feel better, which is not really what I connect to. And so it's been an uncomfortable realization for me as I see it more and more integrated and embedded in systems and services, that's quite disconnected from my own experience and understanding of what peer support was and what drew it to me in the first place, and where I felt like I found something that I hadn't had in my life.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was really interesting that you all kind of spoke to the connection between peer support and this like wider socio-political context, which leads us really nicely into our next question, which is, could you share with us a story or example of where peer support and activism meet? Lisa, you kind of started to talk about this in the last question, so do you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah, so I can think about, I mean, one example that I can think about was a time where it worked really well was when we were part of a grassroots rural collective of peer support and advocacy here in the Scottish Borders. And this was around the time of the Welfare Reform Bill, so like 10, 12 years ago. And so that was the first time I really saw this community that I was part of stepping up into another space and actually saying, okay, not just the world's unjust and this is unfair, because people were really experiencing hardship and adversity and their value being measured on whether or not they could work, which was like sitting in this really uncomfortable neoliberalism space. And actually, you know, how high can you reach, how far can you walk, which was just so disconnected from what people were experiencing. And so as a collective, we did come together and campaign against the Welfare Reform Bill and ask for it. It was brought in by Westminster, but in Scotland, we wanted to implement it different. And we had some control over that with being in Scotland, having a government here. So we were able to advocate for it. It was small things, but they felt big to people. Things like having their doctor's information being allowed to be included because they knew their doctor, rather than it just being an anonymous person deciding whether or not they were entitled to benefits, which is just, again, in the whole space of crazy making. So that's just one time I can think about where I really saw peer support move into activism and collective advocacy, and really thinking about beyond ourselves is actually what do we need to do for our people, our communities, so that things feel less unfair.
Thank you for that, Lisa. Marc, can I pass over to you?
Sure. Thank you for that, Lisa. I mean, I'm going to give two really quick examples, if I may. One is historical and one is much more recent. And if I think I look back to the early days of the HIV epidemic, where there was a lot of informal and peer support happening in LGBTQ communities to support those who were ill and dying, who were being ignored by mainstream healthcare and services. And those people became activists inadvertently by fighting for rights and for treatment. So I think if we look at the example of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in New York in the 1980s and early 90s, is a really strong example of peers coming together. But I think more recently in this country, my mind turns to peer support again for people living with HIV. There were a number of community-based peer support interventions and activities happening across the country, but those are only community-based and not being taken on by the healthcare service, which I'll know we'll talk about later. But those community peer supporters came together and started to lobby government, the NHS, to ensure that peer support became an integral part of primary healthcare. So I think, again, this is a different way of working with the system to try to ensure that what we see works in community can be replicated within the system.
Thank you so much, Marc. Anandi?
Well, in a way, I suppose the foundation, or the setting up of CHARM is an example of the way in which a peer support group decided that they needed to do a lot more. So Paul Baker, who has also founded CHARM with me and others, set up a family support group. And there were just a half a dozen of us, there still are half a dozen of us in this group. And we meet fairly regularly, talk about all kinds of things. And I suppose because of the people that we weren't just kind of talking about our individual situations, but inevitably we're thinking more widely about the stuff that was going on in Manchester. So it was in the middle of the pandemic, and we heard that there was a new hospital going to be built new psychiatric hospital going to be built in North Manchester. And we thought we needed to make it clear that we felt that this wasn't the best use of funds and that we wanted to see changes in community services. So a couple of us wrote quite an extended, letter explaining why this was not the best course of action, and that we wanted Manchester to kind of think again about the way forward. And then, of course, as activists, we circulated that letter far and wide, and I can't remember how many people we got to sign it. Sent it to Andy Burnham and had a meeting with him. Tried to meet with the trust. It was all a bit all over the place at the beginning, just to raise our concerns about the fact that we needed a different kind of system. And then having garnered support for this letter, I don't know, maybe we got about 100 people or something like that to sign it. We thought, well, we ought to try and set up a group so that we can keep raising these issues. And so that's in a sense how Charm got born. So in a sense, it was taking what you might see as a slightly more traditional kind of peer support and then pushing it further. And I mean, I have to say, as someone who's been involved in a lot of activism, that if I hadn't been an activist, if I hadn't been speaking out, my mental health would be in an appalling state, and I would probably be on, medications. And so it's coming together and speaking out, raising all that, the concerns. That's the thing, in a sense, that's enabled me to carry on, because you know that you're not alone, and you know that you're not mad, that actually that it's the system that we're living in that is. And so we've raised all sorts of things. And then because we had this group, then after the Panorama program came out, we were able to raise issues around human rights, and we had a meeting on human rights. And we then decided to collect stories. I mean, and I really believe in the power of stories and of speaking out, and everybody having a story to tell and being able to speak that story. So we've started to, it's a bit kind of minimal, but we started to collect people's stories of experiences, both in inpatient care and community care in Manchester. And we did share some of those with Oliver Shanley, who was doing the report, which will come out in January, about GMMH. And we've done a lot. I mean, we do liaise with the trust and are trying to work with the trust to push it forward, to move it from what is a heavily kind of medical model. So in a sense, the story of Charm is the story of the link between activism and peer support.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. It was really interesting to hear you all talk about this sort of organic relationship between peer support and activism. Thank you so much. So I'm going to pass on to Rory to ask the next couple of questions.
Elena, excuse me. So I think it's really interesting. I've heard a couple of you say kind of like, Lisa, you said maybe we're not crazy, but the world is, right? And I think I've heard that echoed in terms of these spaces being spaces where you get to kind of challenge what are the like dominant ideas and perspectives of the world around you, which might be unfriendly to you for various reasons. So I guess my question is, how can peer support shift those power dynamics and challenge oppressive systems? And Anandi, would you like to jump in first?
Well, I suppose it's when we're speaking out collectively that we have a way better chance of having an impact. And I suppose that is the kind of connection in a sense that I've been talking about in terms of charm, and it relates though in every single area. Of course, at the moment, I'm sure lots of us have been involved in raising the voice about Palestine, and for all, and the whole situation has affected so many people's mental health, and it's there's lots of people that had never been on a Palestinian, my neighbor who'd never been on a Palestinian demo, until a couple of weeks ago. And she said, oh, I just didn't realize how powerful it was, coming on a demonstration, how much better it makes you feel. And I think that's the thing, is that, I don't know. I don't know if I've got anything else to say. It's just that the speaking out is, to me, probably the most important part of peer support, because I don't just want to change things for my own family, I want to change it for everybody.
Yeah, there's that sense of connection, and I guess with that, it's not just connection with like you say, family or very close local concerns. It might be a kind of global thing as well. Mm-hmm. Lisa or Marc, feel free to jump in.
Well, I mean, I'll jump in if you want. Are you ready, Lisa? Yeah, go for it. Okay. I mean, I think for me, it's I try to look at it from a slightly different angle, and I think about the people that are most likely to engage with, want, or need peer support at sometimes in our lives, and those are usually people who have an illness, a disability, come from a marginalized community, or the condition that we have is exacerbated because we come from a marginalized community. And I think that the way that this can challenge oppressive systems is because the aspiration of peer support is it is putting the power and the tools in the hands of those who are marginalized and oppressed. So I think that what we need to do when we're providing or we're engaging people with peer support, and I've done it in my work, particularly with people with HIV, is it's not just about managing your condition. It isn't just about managing your isolation or connecting with communities. And I think, as Anandi has said, it's about giving you voice. And when you feel connected to something, to a community, to others that are going through something as you're similar to yourself, you become empowered. So I think that the trick for us is to try to ensure that all of us who are engaging or delivering or experiencing peer support, it's just not a one thing, so we have the power to push back. So we can lobby, we can advocate for ourselves and for others, but then also to look at whatever is impacting us, which has brought us into peer support, sits in society. So all of those other things which may impact on our lives and our well-being, whatever that oppression may be, we see our condition or experience in that lens, which this allows us to then challenge the oppression or the system, or to make a difference.
Thanks, Marc. So yeah, there's that kind of it changes how you view marginalization or oppression, and it's focused on giving people power rather than, I guess, taking it away, which we often experience that in like healthcare settings and things like that. Lisa, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I love the two answers that have already gone. I'm not sure I have much to add other than, for a long time, I just was so frustrated with conversations talking about what's not working and how power is misused and abused. And it became such a heavy space to be. And then just thinking about activism as another kind of power, but a power that can be used for good, has felt quite energizing, and it's probably kept me in this world. I think I was starting to feel like I was in the vortex of negativity for a long time, where it was just like, how on earth do we do anything here? Everything is so, I'm trying to think of a word that's not swearing, messed up. And thinking about, well, what can we do? What can we do collectively? And thinking about activism as still a form of power and a new power. And I've been reading a book recently about new power and how, even just, if we can do something that feels like we can have a voice, like Marc was saying, that is still powerful. And, for a long time, I just thought power's bad. Power is always misused, and it harms people. And now having this new relationship with even the word or the concept of power feels kind of refreshing.
That's really interesting. Yeah, in terms of yeah, just shifting that kind of notion and thinking about yeah, how people can impact change or can affect change for good. So we've spoken a bit, I think Lisa, you brought this up about kind of the co-option of peer support and how you've seen it change. And I think that's I think I've seen some comments in the chat as well that feels quite present for other people. So in your opinion, how is peer support being co-opted? And how can we push back against this? Lisa, I might go to you first, as you've already spoken about it a little.
I mean, what worries me is that there's versions of peer support now that don't feel like they are what we would call peer support. And there's not really a connection to the history and the fact that peer support was embedded in social movements. People are forgetting or not being taught that part. You know, I'm older, so I'm kind of fortunate that I've kind of known some of the activists and the movement leaders and been kind of educated about some of the history. But then I'll meet people who are working in peer support who think peer support was brought in to make the systems better. It was about jobs and it was about the peer workforce, and more we're having this kind of growing peer workforce. One of my worries is they're employing us, they're employing the activists, and there's not many people that can have an independent, autonomous voice to actually advocate against the systems that are harming people if they're being paid and employed by the same system. So we're kind of losing some activisms through that route and activists. And, you know, there's not so much kind of even activism happening about the harm towards the system. You know, I think about the history of Mad Pride and around some of the social movements that really, you know, and Judy Chamberlain and some of these leaders that did some amazing work. And there's people who are now working in peer support who don't know about some of those histories. And so what I think is lacking is a connection to that kind of fidelity piece around what peer support was actually about. You know, it wasn't about making systems better. It was about relationships and conversations and the connections that come with that and the kind of mutuality piece. And then people are working in peer roles where they're told, well, you can't talk about this, or if someone says this, you're now a mandatory reporter, or you have to do a medication run, or you're there to provide care. That's not peer support. It's just a word and a job title. So I do see it being diluted, co-opted, whatever words we want to use. And that kind of hurts my soul a little bit. I'm still plodding on, but wondering when I can retire, but it's still a while off.
It's interesting. I kind of see a parallel with kind of activism and the yeah, saying this obviously as somebody who's employed by a charity, but the relationship between activism and social movements and charities is really interesting in terms of like you say, obviously people need to live, and often the people who want to make change are people who by reasons of marginalization can find it hard to get other work, or you know, don't want to spend their lives working on something that they don't feel is important. But then, as you say, when that work is linked to being able to pay your rent, it's really, yeah, there's a power dynamic there. There's something there that is really complicated. I've opened, that's a huge can of worms that I'm just kind of like opening up and lying on the table, and we'll solve it by approximately 12:30. That's my promise to you. Marc, did you have any thoughts on the co-option of peer support?
I mean, thank you for that, Lisa, because I echo absolutely everything that you said there. But I also feel a little bit challenged, given that I've been somebody that has fought to have peer support within the system and to have peer supporters employed. But just picking up on what Ruari said, very often those peer supporters in my field were Black African women who were, just being given my citizenship in the country, hadn't worked for years. And so there was that really tricky balance, right, of do I try to make sure these women get paid and their skills are recognized at the same time as trying to ensure that they stay authentic. But I think for me, the challenge goes back to something that you said earlier, Lisa, as well, is I think what we lose is the individualistic, we lose a collective nature of peer support and what that means. And I think, again, if I think about the condition of HIV or other medical conditions, you may go to a healthcare setting and you're given a peer support worker, and that's it. That's your only connection. And they just talk to you simply about what is going on for you at that time. And there is no connection to the history. There is a kind of dampening down of the activism rather than building people up. I'm not sure what the pushback on is that, or how we do that. I always believe that my pushback needs to completely be continually creating new people, empowering a new generation of people. I can put a lot of energy into changing the system, but I think, as most of us know, that can be an uphill battle. So a lot of my energy continues to be developing grassroots peer support people and activists on the ground.
That's such it's a really insightful point, that sense of like, we need to keep going and keep building this kind of momentum, that it's not enough to do it once and say, okay, well, we've got that sorted now, and I think, that point about peer support not being a single point of connection feels really important, because there's a sense of trying to build a community, which isn't going to happen if you just have one person and you see them in quite a regimented way. Anandi, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I really appreciate Lisa and Marc's reflections on this point, and listening to Lisa talking about the co-option of social movements, it made me think about, well, in my day job, I'm an academic, and I wrote a book called Black Star, Britain's Asian Youth Movements, and it was about what it was mainly young Asian males, how they organized in the late 70s and early 80s. And in part of the book, I also talked about the whole process of co-option in the early 80s, with many of the activists being bought off with nice jobs, in councils and education and elsewhere. And so I think that those points that Lisa's speaking about are really important. And funding is, of course, a crucial thing to offer services, but when you're working on an advocacy side, then it becomes problematic, because you can often not even realize it, but you are you are channeling the kinds of things that you perhaps engage with to fit in with what would be acceptable to funders and things like that. So in fact, this did impact on how we set up Charm, because to begin with, I said, I don't want us to take any funding, because if we take funding, we will end up not being able to say everything that we want to say. But then at the same time, you do need to be able to do some things that involve more resources than you can just, collect by passing a hat around, so to speak. So we have now set up a Charm CIC so that we can do like research work, but we've still got the Charm community. So what we've tried to do is to kind of keep these two things going at the same time, so that we can still, if you like, keep our autonomy, and from that point of view, that grassroots power that you have when you're independent, but also do other things which involve funding. I thought the point that Marc spoke about in terms of the need to always be creative is really important, because if we're not constantly being creative, being innovative in the way that we think, in a sense, then we stop really thinking critically, because every single social and historical and political moment involves us doing things in a sense differently. So yeah, those were just the things that I thought of when I was listening to Lisa and Marc. And also the other thing I just thought about was in terms of this whole issue around co-option. Yes, of course, we do want peer support workers within the kind of the institutions of healthcare. But if it's just kind of mediated and moderated to make the system a little better, then of course what it's doing is taking our well, it's taking control in a sense, and the power and autonomy that we invest in ourselves as if we take peer support into a more campaigning level, when it's just kind of left there. So those were the things that I was thinking of. Yeah.
Thank you, Anandi, and thank you so much for that example. I think it's, yeah, in terms of like user-led groups, it's a really common thing to really have to like struggle with what your structure should be, what your funding is going to be, and what kind of obligations that that puts on you, what kind of resources you're able to access. It's a really big issue. So we've got a final question, and then we'll move to some questions from attendees. So what, yeah, just a small one. What do you think the future of peer support looks like? Anandi, would you like to go first?
I think that I would just say I have no idea, but that as long as we maintain some level of activism, continue to work collectively and voice the things that matter to us and empower ourselves in that way, there's a strong future.
Thank you, Anandi. I'll pass to Marc.
I'm always hopeful. I think as long as we are people, we will always need each other, and therefore we will always need our peers. I do think we have to be watchful, because as we can see, there's lots of stuff going on in the world which puts many of us under attack or at risk. So we need to continue to stick together, to come together and find really smart ways. I'm a great believer in smart activism, and sometimes smart activism means kind of engaging with the people that we're least likely to engage with, and to find ways to share our tools and our experiences with them, because sometimes when they're presented with those, they may come along on the journey with us to change that. So I'm always hopeful, and I'd probably just wrap up by saying, you know, what I said in my last answer, that we need to continue to build grassroots peer support and find ways to encourage and enable people who are coming through, who will always need to come on the journey with us.
Thanks, Marc. I love that. Like we will always need each other. It's such like I think sometimes like needing people is thought of as like a vulnerability, but it's actually this wonderful strength and kind of really cool thing about how we can, yeah, how we are. Lisa, would you like to wrap up?
Gosh, I have so many thoughts on this question. I don't know what the answer is. Like, I've got a couple of thoughts, and I could see it going in multiple directions, and I don't know which way it'll go. I'll probably go in all of them at once, but I think we are seeing more and more peer support being integrated into systems and services, and the dilution of peer support in that space. And it is being commodified. It's now something that systems can use. It has a value. And so with that, that's where we're seeing it sit within some of those spaces. But I also see lots of amazing, like Marc saying, these grassroots alternatives led by people who have set things up, social enterprises, that are led by people, not funders. So they're looking at, well, what do we need in our communities, not what do the funders need? So they're thinking more about relational outcomes and how they want to really meet the needs of particular communities. And, you know, I'm all for abolishing the systems, but we're not there yet. And usually when one ends, another one comes in. You know, we had the witchcraft trials and people thought that was great for a while, and now we're in the psychiatry phase. So there'll be something else, some other dominant power structure that would come in place of psychiatry next, I'm sure, and it's probably sitting there waiting to go for all we know. But we need to kind of create alternatives for people, accessible alternatives that don't have these kind of eligibility criteria and, you know, assessments and all of these things that are forcing people into a particular heteronormative existence, and instead just communities where people can just be themselves. And if they choose to live in a forest and not work, then let's celebrate that. Let's just let people be people. So the more alternatives we can see forming and growing and thriving, the better. That will balance out at least some of the other stuff.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We're going to move to taking questions. We've had a few in the chat so far. If you'd like to feel free to pop questions in the chat or raise your hand using like the virtual the virtual thing. I can't see everybody on the screen, so please, yeah, if you use the function on Zoom to raise your hand, because otherwise I might miss it. We've got a question from Rachel Rowan Olive. I'm just trying to find out.
Should I just ask? I can just ask it. That's easier.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I guess something that I struggle with and think about a lot as I've moved more into kind of radical activist spaces that kind of have peer support along as part of that function is burnout, like individually and collectively. And sometimes it feels to me like there's a bit of a tension between kind of wanting to have informal horizontal spaces and guarding against actually labour being quite unevenly distributed in a way that can end up being really painful, and kind of when everybody's struggling, creating some really, really painful and difficult dynamics. And I guess I just wondered if that's something that as a panel you recognise, and if you've kind of found ways through it. Yeah.
Can I answer that one? Yeah.
Please, anyone?
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you raised that, Rachel. I think it's a really important one. And certainly it was an experience for people involved in like anti-racist activism. It still is. I have found, and this is just on a really personal level, in working in mental health campaigning, there's been greater understanding that there are times when you just have to step out. And I think it's something that we should all be aware of, is that, we only have so much resource. We also have personal circumstances, which sometimes mean that we're not able to put in and to do what we could. And having what you described, Rachel, as sort of horizontal organizations with less structure can actually be oppressive. I can't remember who talked about the tyranny of structuralness, and but it's certainly, I think, something that is very real. And there comes a point where you do have to initiate, structures and systems. That doesn't mean that they'll always be the same. If we take the approach that Marc was talking about, is always being creative, we can change them all the time, and we always have to keep reflecting. But absolutely understanding that we only have emotionally, physically, mentally a certain level of resource is essential, and we should all be taking that into account and nurturing each other in whatever shape we work together.
Yeah, and I wonder if I could just add to that I'm really grateful to see the quote from Audre Lorde in the chat, because, I've been thinking more about how does radical self-care factor. We don't talk about it in peer support. People talk about individualistic self-care, which I've always found kind of toxic. It's like, oh, just go and do some yoga and mindfulness and you'll be fine. It's like, it's not really what I need to keep going. And just thinking about, some of the work of Angela Davies and Audre Lorde in terms of kind of looking back to social movements is what does radical self-care look like in terms of staying connected to activism whilst not burning you out completely. And I think that we can get that through, if we come back to relationships, what do we get from relationships, and what relationships do we need to be around us? And yeah, and I think Anandi's right around, sometimes we need to just step back because that's what we need to do. But hopefully, if we're part of a collective and the relationships in place, someone else will step forward and hold that for us. Whereas in a more individualistic approach, we don't have that, you know.
And I've just added really quickly, and on the back of both of that, I've learned this year that rest as resistance is a really important tool. I've lent into a book which I've read called, which I'd recommend anybody reads, called Rest as Resistance by the Nap Ministry, which has taught me that taking naps from my work, be they literal or just breaks where they're intentional, is really radical self-care. So if you can take a nap for half an hour and just switch off, and we are allowed to say no. I think it's very important. We are allowed to say no.
Thank you, everybody. Joy, I can see a hand up there. We probably, sorry, I've just looked at the time. Let's, I can take Joy's question, and then I think we probably have to wrap up. But go ahead, Joy.
Thank you, Ruari. Please may I ask the panel, mental health services often assume or even plan that there will be throughput of intentional peer support workers. Therefore, often there is no career structure envisaged for such people. They are expected to leave to enter different workforces or somewhere else within the NHS workforce to progress. What is the panel's experience of this, and how will activism for peer support be continued by these people or the people here today for peer support when services, at least the people that within the UK NHS system, expect turnover of staff? Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. Does anyone want to come in on that?
I'm happy to jump in first, and then maybe Marc and Anandi can add. You know, one of my frustrations, and I suppose this comes back to the question around power and how power is held, is that we often see the people in leadership roles are the people with academic and clinical knowledge, and the people on the front line doing all the hard work are the people with the experiential knowledge. And how can we actually challenge what knowledge is valued within within society as much as anything else, not just in systems? Because I think there's almost like, oh well, this knowledge, this is valuable, this is the proper knowledge, and that, oh, that's over there, and that's quite nice to have within a conversation. You can share your story. And so I think we need to challenge that. I mean, this is why I really feel we need leaders and you know, communities that are set up and run by people who have, you know, an experiential wisdom, and not just people, you know, that are part of systems that are led by more kind of clinical leaders. Because otherwise you do get this point, which Joy's saying, where it's like, oh well, I'm a peer worker, well where now? Unless there's like a clear pathway to actually, I think that services and communities should be run by people who have the experience of whatever it is that they're connecting over.
Yeah, I think just very briefly, of course, any job within the NHS should have a progression structure, and in fact, it's supposed to. So it's possible to you know, to campaign and to argue for that to be created. But as Lisa mentioned, if you've got a structure where the clinicians, in a sense, are in the you've got a structure of a kind of a medical model, then the peer support worker would have to be going down the road of embracing that model of care. And then that's the question, as whether that's what we're looking to achieve. So it's a contradictory thing, I think, because they've got peer support workers in a system that they don't necessarily really want to make radical changes to.
I haven't got anything to add to either of those, really. I support both what my colleagues have said.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been this has been wonderful, and yeah, I think like really kind of challenging and eye-opening in a lot of ways as well. So thank you so much to panelists and to everybody who has attended as well. Elena, did you want to wrap up at all and come in again?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to reiterate what Rory said. Thank you so much. Yeah, to all the panelists. It's been a really, really interesting and insightful discussion. And there's also been a really rich conversation happening in the chat as well. So yeah, thank you to everyone for coming and contributing to the session. And I'll wrap up there.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, you.
Everyone. See you at some of the other sessions.
Thank you. That was amazing.
Pretty good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.